Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China's environmental challenges and the U.S. responses has come to order. The United States and China face many challenges related to the environment, from protecting air and water at home to global action to address climate change. This hearing will expand the Commission's understanding of these issues at a critical time. We are less than 6 weeks before the world meets in Glasgow for COP26, the pivotal United Nations Climate Conference. Events of this summer demonstrate the ravages of climate chaos, from the deadly flooding in Zhengzhou in central China to raging wildfires and heat waves in the American West. And as the world heads into COP26, we face a stark choice. We can take urgent, bold, transformative action to transition to clean and renewable energy, or we can resign ourselves to ever worsening impacts to our lives, our livelihoods, and our economies. Each of us has to do our part. Governments, especially China, and especially the United States, must come to Glasgow ready to do their fair share. This hearing will shed light on the status of China's climate commitments and compliance, as well as other pressing environmental issues such as the fight for clear air and clean water, the actions of non-governmental organizations or NGOs to push for local accountability, the effects of climate change, grassland management, forced ecological migration and mining on Tibetans, and the downstream effects on other countries of Chinese dam projects. Those are hydro dam projects. This commission is dedicated to faithfully and accurately reporting on all the issues we cover, including the environment and climate change. And this hearing will provide perspectives on areas of successful environmental governance, as well as violations of human rights and the rule of law. China is helping spearhead a shift toward dramatically greater production of renewable energy sources at the same time as it leads the world in building out coal infrastructure, both at home and through the export of coal-fired power plants through the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese government now prioritizes environmental protection and gives space for some elements of civil society to operate, at the same time that it continues to harass and detain rights advocates like those documented in the Commission's political prisoner database. Even where China takes positive steps to protect the environment, the government's repressive and authoritarian nature can produce tragic human consequences. In this hearing, we'll hear from a leading supply chain expert whose research uncovered evidence that the modern slavery Uyghurs are subjected to in Xinjiang and through the government's labor transfer programs extends to China's massive solar industry. The global economy must transition as quickly as possible to renewable energy sources like solar. But we cannot do so on the backs of slave labor. We need to help the solar industry transition to sustainable supply chains that respect human rights. And that means diversifying supply chains away from reliance on those that use forced labor. It means building up the domestic manufacturing base here in the United States and in other countries abroad. And most urgently, it means that the House of Representatives must pass and the President must sign into law the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that Senator Rubio and I led in the Senate and that my co-chair leads in the House. I look forward to all of our witnesses' testimony, and I hope this hearing will demonstrate the United States can and must prioritize both climate action and the steadfast defense of human rights. We need to do both. We cannot trade away human rights for cooperation in other areas of the relationship with China. Fortunately, China has its own domestic incentives to take climate change and environmental protection seriously. I hope this hearing will deepen our understanding of how China can respond to those incentives and take urgent action, just as the United States must do here at home. I'd now like to recognize my co-chair, Congressman McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this timely hearing on China's environmental challenges. For more than 15 years, this commission has monitored the Chinese government's policies on the environment because of the nexus between respect for human rights and the rule of law and a society's ability to address environmental problems. The people of China continue to struggle not only with air and water pollution and other hazards, but also with obstacles to the ability to advocate for change or seek remedies through their government. This hearing comes 5 weeks before nations of the world gather in Glasgow at the UN Climate Change Conference. China and the United States are the top two emitters of greenhouse gases. Solving the climate crisis will require both cooperation and a robust and genuine effort within each country to change its regulatory regime and consumption behavior. President Biden's top climate envoy, former Secretary John Kerry, has been engaged with his Chinese counterparts on bilateral cooperation. But we in America also need to do our job. We must pass robust domestic legislation to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, transform our economy, and ensure that future generations have a right to a habitable planet. There is no trade-off between the environment and the economy. We can create millions of good, high-wage green jobs that ensure economic prosperity and reduce our carbon impact. Now, I understand that some experts give the Chinese government positive marks for addressing climate change at a macro level. I look forward to hearing the assessment of our witnesses. Further, I would like to understand the extent to which Chinese officials' decisions are guided by their sense of the country's self-interest in terms of the economic and social consequences of a warming climate. This is important to know as the United States government figures out how the modalities of cooperation with China. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has explicitly linked cooperation on climate with other issues. He essentially threatened to halt cooperation if the U.S. did not back off criticism of their conduct. Is this a tactic to get us to stop caring about whether the Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghurs, erasing democracy in Hong Kong, or jailing human rights lawyers? How do we respond? Environmental progress in any country depends on actions at both the national and local level. A focus on the Chinese government's climate commitment should not deter us from looking at what is happening on the ground. This commission has reported on the Chinese government's increasingly tight grip on NGOs and civil society, which has affected the environmental sector. Lack of transparency and uneven enforcement are obstacles. Environmental researchers and advocates have been suppressed and detained, including ethnic minorities. Those jailed include former Xinjiang University President Tashpolat Tayyip, who is investigating pollution from coal mining, and Tibetan Anya Sangdra, who campaigned against illegal mining and poaching in Qinghai. We are also interested in threats to the ecology of Tibet and into threats of the ecology of Tibet. The Tibetan Policy and Support Act, which I was proud to sponsor, sets out U.S. policy on the environment and water resources on the Tibetan Plateau and directs the Secretary of State to support collaborative research, encourage input from Tibetan nomads, and promote a regional framework on water security. So I hope to hear about practical steps that we can take towards these goals. Lastly, there is the solar industry's role in Xinjiang. We need to deploy more solar technology, but we cannot abet the forced labor that has the U.S. government, that we cannot abet the forced labor that the U.S. government has determined is used to produce solar components. Can the United States government encourage diversity in solar sourcing to reduce reliance on tainted polysilicon from Xinjiang? Does the coal burned to produce this material undermine climate goals? I want to thank you, and I look forward to your testimony. As I said earlier, I'm convening a Rules Committee meeting at 10:15 on the continuing resolution to keep the government open, so I'm going to be in and out. But I thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman McGovern, and thank you for working to keep the government open. So I'd like to now introduce our panel. Dr. Jennifer Turner is director of the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center. For 18 years, she has led creation of meetings, exchanges, and publications focusing on a variety of energy and environmental challenges facing China, particularly on water, energy, and green civil society issues. She is a widely quoted expert on U.S.-China environmental cooperation, as well as climate-related challenges and governance issues facing China. She also leads the Global Choke Point Multimedia Reporting Initiative. Second, Dr. Jessica C. Tietz is Associate Professor in the Political Science Department at Middlebury College and Associate Editor of the Journal of Chinese Political Science. Her research focuses on governments and policy diffusion in authoritarian regimes, specifically the role of civil society. She is author of Civil Society Under Authoritarianism, the China Model, and editor of Local Governance Innovation in China, Experimentation, Diffusion, and Defiance. Dr. Tietz was recently selected to participate in the Public Intellectuals Program created by the National Committee on United States-China Relations and is currently researching policy experimentation by local governments in China. Dr. Emily Ye is professor of geography at the University of Colorado. Dr. conducts research on nature-society relations in Tibetan areas of the People's Republic of China, including the political ecology of pastoralism, conflict over access to natural resources, vulnerability of Tibetan herders to climate change, and more. She is the author of Taming Tibet, The Landscape Transformation and the Gift of Chinese Development. Ms. Nirola Alima, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your names correctly, hopefully I'll get them right shortly, is a supply chain researcher at the Helena Kennedy Center at Sheffield Hallam University. She lived and studied in Xinjiang for 19 years and worked as a customs broker and in import-export in Shanghai, Beijing, and other cities in China. She co-authored a report that revealed the scope of forced labor in the solar supply chain in Xinjiang. So we're now turning to our first witness. And who's up first? Jennifer Turner, are you with us?
I am indeed. Can you hear me
Great.
okay?
We can hear you, yes.
I love it when technology works. Thank you very much, Chairman Merkley, Chairman McGovern, and respective members of the commissions. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present today and dive deep into some of China's climate commitments and clean energy transition, probably diving deeper in the Q&A. We're going to be brief here right now. To keep it brief, starting off with, I have three main points that I want to make that we can discuss later in more detail. Number one, China is accelerating decarbonization of its energy sector, but there are contradictory trends that have the potential to slow it down. First of all, as mentioned already, well, China in the past for the past 9 out of 10 years, China has been number one in clean energy investments and leads the world in wind, solar, EVs, supergrid development, batteries, algae for energy. I mean, you name it, they're investing in it. And this kind of investment has been bringing down the cost of these clean energy technologies around the world. But also, as was mentioned in the introduction, there are also some other risks with this. Now, number two trend here was that China has made significant progress in decarbonizing their energy sector. I often say it's like turning the coal Titanic. I mean, they've dropped their dependence on coal in their energy sector from like 71% in 2009, and now it's down to about 58%. But the country is still number one in existing and planned coal-fired power capacity. On the green side, just a couple little stories. China installed more than 70 gigawatts of new wind capacity. That's over half of what the US has right now in 2020. Now, despite the high numbers of installed wind and other renewables, China still loses wind power due to low turbine quality, grid connection problems. They are still building the grid up, but it takes time. Insufficient battery storage. And most importantly, I think for the commission here is that there's governance challenges. Grid operators and provinces will still give priority to coal, sometimes with Beijing's permission, sometimes not. Now, to get around the grid problems, in 2019, 2020, the central government decided they're going to go into offshore wind. And today, in just like 2 years, they now have a quarter of the world's offshore wind with fewer connectivity problems. All right, the second trend to note, China is meeting its Paris commitments, but they need to go much more aggressive, bolder and deeper to hit their own 2030 CO2 peak and 2060 carbon neutrality goals. The 13th five-year plan really is what galvanized so much of the most recent investments and policy changes that made things cleaner and greener domestically. But the 14th five-year plan was pretty disappointing. It doesn't really even allows for a little bit of increased coal. My testimony gives lots of bullet points and talking about the different kinds of domestic measures that are taking place with the grid expansion. I particularly am fond of the solar power Darwinism, where 2018 they cut all their feed-in tariffs, and then 2 years later, half of the private companies were gone. So survival of the fittest. And we're going to see that trend again with probably EVs, batteries. It's just how it works there. Now, number 3 point, which I know is of everyone's quite concerned with, of course, is in the first 5 years of China's Belt and Road Initiative, about 80% of the energy investments were in fossil fuels. And that ostensibly, between 2013 and 2018, nullified China's own domestic progress. The good news is that there appears to be a slowdown. In 2019 and 2020, about $47 billion worth of coal projects were suspended or terminated. Suspended doesn't mean stopped. Tsinghua University issued a report that if China continues with these coal belt and road projects, that it will nullify all the efforts of other countries to bring down the carbon footprint. So there's been a lot of bad press about this, on China. The Japanese are stopping their coal investments. So it's possible that the Xi Jinping's push for greening the BRI may end up decreasing the coal investments. The US government, the Biden administration is also, as we all know, is very much pushing climate action at home and internationally. So there is a perfect window here for the US and China to embark on, let's say, a climate change space race. It may be difficult to work as closely as we did in the past, but there are lots of opportunities. And thinking about, we could go deeper in the Q&A, but like, how can we either in parallel or together, work overseas? I think if you look at some of the past models of the US-China climate and clean energy cooperation, there's some supermodels of clean energy research centers that brought together business, national labs, NGOs, mainly US NGOs, to work on electric vehicles, renewable energy, cleaner coals, and my favorite, don't forget energy efficiency in buildings. Major carbon footprint in both the US and China. I know it's not as exciting as solar and wind, but those are some of the kind of issues that could happen. I think I'm going to stop here because I probably hit my 5 minutes or over, sorry. And we can continue in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turner. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Tietz.
Thank you. I would like to thank, first of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to start by thanking Senator Merkley and Representative McGovern and their staff for inviting me to testify today, and also to say that I'm really looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists who are all experts on Chinese environmental governance. I feel like I'm already learning a lot. My remarks today will focus on China's changing environmental governance and the role specifically of environmental NGOs. And the central point I wish to emphasize today is that environmental governance has improved in China under Xi Jinping. However, this progress comes at the expense of citizen participation and local policy experimentation. So before 2013, China suffered from what we sometimes call a policy implementation gap. And this is because local officials were concentrating solely on economic growth and didn't enforce the environmental regulations. So what we've seen then is that Xi Jinping has reduced this gap by utilizing more central government authority to enforce regulations. This is a more top-down model. But also there's been a shift towards more market-based approaches, such as payment for ecosystem services, emissions taxes, and the establishment of a carbon market. So this new environmental governance model uses three main tools. One is environmental targets for promotion, and these are often in place of the former economic targets for local officials. The second is digital monitoring tools, and this is so that information about water quality or air quality isn't controlled by local officials, but sent directly to the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And the third main tool are environmental inspection teams, and these are sent to cities and provinces as a way to incentivize local enforcement. There's also a role, though, for an environmental NGOs, and this is mostly collecting information, but also sometimes bringing public interest lawsuits against polluters and local government. So since 2015, environmental NGOs have been allowed to file lawsuits against local officials and firms for pollution. However, this was really a very confined space. So only the biggest NGOs qualified. Courts would only hear certain cases, and these suits were expensive and time-consuming. Despite these challenges, we did see that bigger groups like Friends of Nature have filed several lawsuits and won these cases. I think in a hopeful sign, we saw last year that Shenzhen adopted a new policy that should allow a more diverse set of environmental NGOs to bring these lawsuits. And they did this by trying to exempt or cover court fees so it's not so expensive. And I think many hope that, as we've seen in the past, that Shenzhen will serve as a pilot case for future national regulations. We also see that many environmental NGOs use public pressure campaigns on local leaders to increase enforcement. I think one really well-known example is the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, or IPE, and they rank local governments and firms through pollution maps, and these are available on their website and via apps. Another tactic that I've written about that I found really interesting is the use of humor to focus public attention. So for example, in Zhejiang province, there was a swimmable rivers campaign, and this used social media to create a competition for local officials to swim in the rivers that they had just certified as clean water, sort of a Aaron Brockovich strategy. And not surprisingly, most local officials were not willing to take them up on this challenge, but the public pressure that was generated captured the central government's attention. And this led not only to better water quality in Zhejiang, but also the creation of a citizen scientist river guardian program. So despite the restrictions that we've seen developing on civil society in the last decade, environmental NGOs are still playing a fairly active role in environmental governance. In fact, this is probably the most open policy space in China for civil society. They face the same challenges as other groups, though, in registering groups and projects, needing to establish party cells in the bigger groups, and also with fundraising. After the passage of the Foreign NGO law and the removal of international grants, they've had to turn to government grant programs, and this influences the types of projects that they can take on. All of these constraints result in bifurcation, where you see that the bigger groups are able to play a pretty prominent role, but the smaller groups really struggle to survive. However, unlike other issue areas, this is an area of concern for Chinese citizens, and so we see lots of smaller groups of citizens active in this space. There are homeowners associations doing sort of NIMBY-style movements like protesting waste incinerators in their neighborhoods. There's also a lot of campus environmental clubs, so a lot of young people who are interested. So based on citizen interest and also Xi Jinping's personal interest in environmental protection, I think this likely means that domestic politics will support the continued push on environmental enforcement. I think that the policy agenda might be narrower as groups focus more on government priority, but these groups also might have better access to policymakers to change regulations. I also think that there's still room for the US to engage with a people-to-people strategy, mostly at the local level, trying to focus on local issues in common. Dr. Turner pointed out the reduction of coal, and we have states in the United States and provinces in China that both have that in common. We could also focus on skill development with these environmental NGOs, so not funding them, but developing skills, and also building relationships between local officials who will become the next generation of leaders. I have more concrete suggestions, but I'll save those for the Q&A. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tietz. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Ye.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'd like to start also by thanking Chairmans Merkley and McGoverns and the Commission for this opportunity to speak briefly about several of China's major environmental challenges. And the first one I want to talk about is challenges facing Tibet. The most significant one for Tibet is anthropogenic climate change, and that's because it's interconnected with all other aspects of the environment and thus with culture, economy, and society. The Tibetan Plateau is warming significantly faster than the global average, and what's important here as elsewhere is not average temperatures, but rather increased intensity, frequency, and duration of extremes. So some ways in which it's mattering for Tibetans. First, because of melting permafrost and glaciers and increased precipitation in some places, lakes are rapidly expanding, inundating grazing lands. This is leading to a dramatic loss of grassland, decreased livestock health because of salinization of soil, and ultimately displacement of pastoralists from rangelands. Second, rural Tibetans have become extraordinarily dependent for income on caterpillar fungus, which is a prized Chinese medicinal. It's especially important for income for former herders who have been resettled, and it's declining in part due to climate change. Third, climate change is leading to hazardous events, so landslides in particular and glacial lake outburst floods. Fourth, rangeland degradation. The government has traditionally blamed herders and a tragedy of the commons for rangeland degradation, but there's increasing evidence that it's really climate and precipitation that drives vegetation rather than overgrazing. And this has made it increasingly difficult for herders to maintain a livelihood, which is important because, again, Tibetan cultural practices, identity, and language really have greater vitality in rural areas. And it also, provides reasons for resettling herders. Finally, hydrological changes, of course, melting glaciers, thawing permafrost, changing precipitation patterns have downstream effects of flooding, drought, changing timing of the hydrological cycle, which impacts fisheries and agriculture. And locally, there's more water in the short term and probably drought in the long term. Second, there's a series of environment-related policy challenges for Tibetans. One has to do with rangeland privatization. Traditionally, grasslands were managed in commons starting in the 80s, a tragedy of the commons assumption, not well backed up in science, but an assumption was adopted, which has led to privatization of use rights and fencing, and that's led to a whole series of problems that I can talk about. What I want to emphasize here is that this has continued together with reductions in livestock numbers, which are, again, based in unwarranted assumptions. And these new policies in the area of Qinghai, which is called the head source of the three rivers, Yangtze, Yellow, and Mekong, it's been combined with ecological resettlement. Between 2004 and 2010, 55,000 herders and 10,000 households have been resettled purportedly for ecological reasons. And what I want to emphasize here is that it's been dubbed a climate adaptation strategy, but increasing ecological evidence suggests that it's really not adaptive for the climate. Where we know that climate change has negative effects for vegetation, but these effects are modulated or made less bad in the face of moderate grazing. So climate adaptation is crucial, but we need to be careful that these policies are actually adaptive. Of course, these policies also have very severe social effects. So many settlements are poorly built without adequate water or sanitation infrastructure. Standards of living have declined due to subsidies not keeping in pace with inflation. And there's some, herding is a very complex set of skills, but former herders generally don't have the ability to enter the job market. And so many resettled Tibetans live on government subsidies and sale of caterpillar fungus. More importantly, of course, resettlement also undermines traditional ties to territory and thus works together with current assimilationist trends to erode linguistic and cultural continuity. And now there's also ecological resettlement policies happening in the TAR. Mining has traditionally been a flashpoint of protest. There's some evidence that the ecological civilization push that Dr. Teese talked about has shut down many small mines while larger ones continue. Weather modification, I want to flag as something that's heavily institutionalized within China, and that's likely to become more common with climate change as it changes precipitation patterns, and that it can have negative localized effects. Chinese dam projects downstream is a separate issue, and all I want to say here is that dams are being built like crazy, partly because of it's an outlet for capital investment and because it is purported to be, a part of the strategy for becoming carbon neutral. And I think calling them carbon neutral is quite problematic. Large dams change river function downstream, leading to problems for fisheries and agriculture. And in 2019, there were, there's a documentation from satellite imagery that there was adequate water during the wet season upstream, but an unprecedented drought downstream. And that was because of withholding of water upstream so that downstream electricity could be generated at higher prices. And then finally, I just want to mention, because what Dr. Turner talked about is so important, that we have to remember, I think it's really important as we get to negotiations to think not just about China's being the largest, China and the US being kind of the largest annual producer, because China's, even though it's true, China's historical and per capita production of greenhouse gases is still quite a bit lower. What's really important to emphasize is that China is building so much coal-fired power plants, so many, and that this power capacity is not needed. There is a severe overcapacity right now. If it stopped building power plants today, China would have more than enough through 2030, right? And I think that we have to remember that these new plants have a lot of embedded emissions, which have long-term consequences for climate change. And I also think that, you know, a political economic analysis shows that this is not so much about just policy implementation failure, but about China capital needing a place to go. And so these environmental issues have to be tied up with economic cooperation as well. And I'll leave other things to the Q&A as I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now we're going to turn to our fourth witness, Ms. Alima. And am I pronouncing your name right?
It's correct, Mirola Alima.
Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Merkley, Chairman McGovern, and distinguished member of the Commission, thank you for offering me an opportunity to testify. The solar industry is vulnerable to forced labor in Xinjiang because 95% of the solar module rely on one primary material, solar-grade polysilicon. In 2020, China produced nearly 75% of the world's polysilicon, which includes solar-grade and electronic-grade. The four largest producers in Xinjiang alone accounted for 45% of the world's solar-grade polysilicon supply. Hoshan Silicon Industry, the metallurgical grade silicon producer, input into polysilicon in the region with the highest production capacity, has participated in the state-sponsored forced labor transfer program in Xinjiang. All four of Xinjiang's largest polysilicon manufacturers, Daqo, TBEA, Xinjiang GCL, and East Hope, have reported their participation in labor transfer or labor placement programs and/or are supplied by the raw materials companies that have. Daqo alone is supplier to four largest solar module manufacturers in the world: Jinko Solar, Trina Solar, Longji Green Energy, and GA Solar. Professor Murphy and I identified 11 companies engaged in forced labor transfers, 4 additional companies located within industry parks that have accepted labor transfer, 19 Chinese and international companies whose supply chains are affected. Lastly, manufacturers at the various stage of production of solar module, from the raw materials to metallurgical grade silicon, to polysilicon, to wafers, to panels, were complicit in forced labor. However, forced labor wasn't the only problem in the solar supply chains. Moving manufacturing to Xinjiang, where they're producing polysilicon using coal-based energy, helped China to cut everyone out of the market by making the price of polysilicon very low. Coal is cheap and it's heavily subsidized in Xinjiang. To encourage polysilicon companies to move to the Xinjiang in the mid-2010s, the government promoted the development of Drendong coal power base, which has powered the polysilicon giants that moved into the region. Companies moved to Xinjiang around 2015 and 2016 and became fully operational in 2018. From that time, most other polysilicon markets in the world have changed their business model to not produce the polysilicon anymore. The global solar industry faced limit, but the feasible alternatives to source solar materials tainted by forced labor in Xinjiang. There are A, technologies that don't use polysilicon at all. B, polysilicon manufacturers that don't use Xinjiang input at all. C, emerging technologies that have previously been priced out of development because of the China's low prices. It is critical that US enforce the Tariff Act to ensure that the Xinjiang-made goods, which are both bad for the human rights and for the planet, are not reaching to the United States consumers. And as our evidence shows, this violation reached all the way to the raw materials, and there can be no part of the supply chains that is unaffected. Pursuing alternative to Xinjiang supply chains require multiple organizations and government to harmonize strategies. This is not only the US responsibility. Therefore, I urge the US government to work with the EU and other allies, including my own Swedish government. I am grateful to the committee for the opportunity to also relate my personal story. My cousin Mayra Yaqub sentenced to 6.5 years in prison after being accused of financing terrorism. She was convicted for transferring money to Australia to help her parents buy a house, which was both legal at the time she made the transfer and facilitated by the Bank of China. The Chinese government knows she's innocent because I have sent evidence that can prove her innocent to the Xinjiang government multiple times with help of international journalists. In order to deliberately convict an innocent person, the Hojia Public Security Bureau fabricated evidence. She was forced to sign a false confession under threat of the torture, and this false confession was used as evidence to convict her. In addition, authorities falsely claimed that her parents in Australia were members of the so-called Eastern Turkestan Liberation Organization, an organization we have never heard of. Mayra's parents want to seek justice through the international legal system for their daughter, but they have been told there isn't much a lawyer can do when it comes to the crime that Chinese state committed. We did everything we could to extend the Chinese official have threatened me and my family for speaking out public, but still all our efforts have failed to bring her justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, thank you for sharing your own cousin's experience, which illuminates the descriptions you have in your testimony of how initial incentives gradually or steadily proceed to high pressure, including extreme punishment, as you've described. We're now going to enter a period of questions, and I think we're doing 7-minute periods. My team will make sure that I don't go over those 7 minutes, and then we'll turn to Co-Chair McGovern if he is back, and if not, I believe Congressman Mast will be up next, just as to get this started. I wanted to begin with some questions for Dr. Teets, and I was struck back in 2015, Dr. Teets, about when an individual who had been an investigative reporter for China Central Television, Chai Jing, proceeded to do a documentary called Under the Dome. And it was a searing examination and a reference to Chinese citizens living under this dome of polluted air. And I remember she was particularly motivated because she was pregnant with her first child and became very, very concerned about what the health impacts would be. And it seemed like there had been a lot of cooperation, including government cooperation with her production of that documentary, but then also an enormous backlash from other parts of the government that hate criticism or anything that makes things look bad or might encourage citizens to protest. So it reflected this division. Can you give us some sense of how from that time forward we have seen the government under President Xi become really committed in a way to enforcement of environmental rules, and recognizing citizen concern? Has citizen concern really played a big role in creating more space in this area than in many other areas where we see that it's very hard for citizens to be engaged in public interest law or women rights advocates or civil society advocates, but in this space there's a little more room for pressure and how that dynamic exists? Dr. Teets,
Yes,
can I have you back?
that's a really good question. I think that what you're seeing in civil society in general, but also with environmental civil society, is that if groups keep protests or their focus much more narrow, that isn't seen as threatening. So one of the problems with the release of that documentary was how quickly it went viral. And so people were watching it in lots of different countries, they were talking about it. And so it was sort of a victim of its own popularity. So the cases that have been more successful have really been focused at the local level. They haven't been focused at the national level. So there isn't a national indictment of current leaders. So usually the framing is to focus on local challenges, like you want to build a waste incinerator in Shanghai, and the local people say, we don't want that. And so if they keep those protests local like that, it seems that the government is more responsive.
So what we're seeing, I think if I followed your testimony right, is smaller NGOs are being squeezed out. So you've got larger national, and these are China-based NGOs. The government doesn't want mass protests, but they are kind of responding by saying, hey, we're going to encourage enforcement. So we're going to address this, but we're going to keep a really tight rein and a national kind of authoritarian rein, if you will, on addressing this, but also allowing uh, uh, pressure on local officials, as long as you don't kind of criticize the national power structure. Is that kind of a way to portray it?
That I think that's exactly it. It's basically this top-down model doesn't mind citizen participation, but it has to go through the right channels. So there are some areas like Xinjiang or Tibet where we see that these are just no-go areas. There are very few open spaces there. The environment's much more open, but still it's a top-down model. So you're supposed to do things in the appropriate way through the appropriate channels, and your focus has to be local.
So our commission staff, the Congressional-Executive Commission on China, has been monitoring cases this past year of harassment and in some cases detention of independent NGO advocates for their environmental activism. Li Ganshan is an example, Zhang Boji, and Neo Hibo. Authorities also briefly detained a teenage advocate, Hao Hongyi, after she staged a global climate strike in Shanghai municipality. So are these individuals, are they, is the government kind of taking action on these individuals to remind them that, no, we're not going to tolerate any broader criticism, or why are these folks being targeted given the government's overall sense that they do want greater environmental enforcement?
Again, most of the cases that are targeted like that are sort of victims of their own success, in that whatever method they're using or whatever message or platform they're using, they usually get a lot of attention. And so that sort of protest sort of triggers this government response that's pretty much about protecting themselves and deflecting criticism. Most of the protests that I look at that are successful, again, are really focused on a specific issue, like a siting of a chemical factory, siting of an incineration facility, the water quality in a particular river. So they're really focused. And when the government begins to act to address those issues, they cooperate with the government. So again, I would say that really the only rules, if you want to call it something like that, are to keep the issues focused locally and keep them specifically on certain issues. So it can't be about climate change or pollution across the whole country.
Thank you very much, Doctor and Ms. Elima. I wanted to turn to your testimony, and I'll just get started here before my time will run out. But first, I wanted you to explain to folks the difference between essentially forced labor in Xinjiang and then forced labor transfer, which my understanding is essentially persons under the same huge restrictions of forced labor are transported out of the province to other areas to provide a workforce, but it's still very much the same problem of essentially slave labor. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And you talked about how the market had been really blown up for solar grade polysilicon in a very short period of time. And one of the subsidies is very cheap energy coming from coal. But were there other subsidies that the Chinese government provided to essentially take over this world manufacturing sector?
Um, because of the cheap energy prices that were there's a lot of the factor behind this why the production has been product has been so cheap, not only in the solar industry but also almost all of the industry. It's because of the cheap energy prices that were unavailable to the international competitors. If I use the solar as example, like polysilicon, as is made in Xinjiang, is a heavily cold energy consuming product. So that purification process requires extremely high temperatures, so which consume significant electricity, make the Uyghur region coal-fired as an ideal location for the polysilicon producer. But this is not only fact. Another one is the Xinjiang prefecture governments, they have provided significant finance and tax incentives to the companies that move to or build facility in Xinjiang. And then when it's come to the local government, they will add incentives. And the third one is the forced labor transfer program.
Okay, very good. I think my time is up. Yes, I'm getting the nod. So I'm going to come back, but I really appreciate you laying out the details of the impact on forced labor strategies. And I know we use this term forced labor, but I want folks to understand just how horrific this practice is, and is tied to a broader set of strategies that essentially involve what both Democratic and Republican administrations of the United States have determined is genocide. So thank you very much. And we're going to turn now to Congressman McGovern, if he is back, and I don't believe that he is. Hard at work trying to keep our government from getting shut down, and so that would be Congressman Mast, if you are present. And if not, we're turning to Congresswoman Steele.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a really interesting issue because, we've been hearing about all these speakers regarding it's been regional, but since Chinese government is top down, and do you truly think that China cares about being transparent and accountable for these environmental issues? Anybody can answer that, I really didn't hear much about what Chinese government wants to do, but all local governments have been working. So if anybody can answer this, I'd be grateful.
I would be happy to go ahead and take the first stab at it, and other people can join in. I don't think that the Chinese government necessarily wants to be open and transparent about environmental information outside of the government, but what they do want is transparency within the government. So they want the transparent flow of information about what's happening at the local level to go to the Ministry of Environment and Ecology, and they also want it to go to the central government. So they want to know what's happening at the local level, but they're not necessarily interested in that information being shared out widely. They have responded to citizen complaints and tried to make their data more widely available, so clean air measurements, clean water measurements. But there are a lot of criticisms that this information isn't updated all that frequently, and it has sort of a clean bias, right? So that the information that's reported usually shows better conditions than what other people are finding. So I think that's what we're seeing, is that the accountability and the transparency is within the government and not out to the people. But my fellow panelists might want to add to that.
Can I just add to that question then? How many people in China are having serious health effects due to Chinese government's, pollution? Do we have any true data? Because it seems like very hard to get any data out of Chinese government.
Hi, Jennifer here. Can you hear me okay? Good.
Yes, thank you.
There has been over time, more so back with the air apocalypses back in 2012 and 2013, where there were numbers like 1.2 million people dying early because of respiratory problems. And then we saw studies like even Greenpeace China partnering with the Beijing School of Health, looking at hospitals admissions and making estimates. So I think that there is a fair amount of transparency in that, there has been research done in that space. And I think that it was that kind of research. And I thought, again, fascinating to have, NGOs partnering with health researchers. And there's a big growing network of health researchers in China who are making their voices heard. That was one of the fires that really lit the war on air pollution, because we did right before the war on air pollution. We saw lots more protests. public on social media, not just on the streets. So they are responsive, and they do see that if they're not transparent on, for example, pollution information, the monitors, right? It was required under the Air Pollution Action Plan that all cities had to, it had to be open to the public. If you're meeting the PM 2.5 or ozone or other kinds of leading pollutant targets. And there was one example where the US NGO, Natural Resources Defense Council, partnered with a Chinese NGO, and they did a study of how the cities were performing on reporting their data openly, or they're reporting their data, but did they meet the goals? And they found out that, I think this was back in 2014, 2015, that of the 80 cities, only like 7 were actually meeting the goals, and that information was made public, and that was that was a sign that the central government was using information, just like Dr. Teets said, that to pressure the local government. But we've seen NGOs that are not only producing maps of government data, but my favorite is do you know the story of the Foul and Filthy River campaign? No, maybe not. Okay. It was actually about 60. I know Dr. Teets does, where the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Housing, they sent out on social media, I guess trying to be cool, that, hey, citizens, if you see a foul and filthy black stinky river, take a picture of it, geolocate it, and let us know where it is. And they were just, can I use a water pun? They were inundated with data. And so they didn't know what to do with it. So a number of NGOs started helping them to build maps on this so the government could kind of help monitor. So there have been intriguing situations. In this case, citizen science data, the government wanted to respond and had to turn to an NGO to help them do it. So there's, there's not always there's not transparency on everything, but there is still, I think there is political space, elbow rooms, like Dr. Teets said, but I think she would also agree with me that that space is coming a little bit tighter these days.
So it's a little tighter. The Paris Agreement started in 2016, and then one of the speakers that they met. So it seems like they're actually underreporting the amount of coal it consumes and other stuffs, because it seems like, we never really get the right, true data from Chinese government. So when they met Paris Agreement, it really, you don't know it really met or not. It depends on that how they are reporting it, right?
Well, a lot. What has been helpful over the past, have a front row seat for 21 years looking at China, energy, environment, climate stuff, and I've really seen over the past decades that a lot of Chinese and international energy experts, they keep their hand on the pulse of this, and a number of them said quite a few years ago that China probably met their Paris commitments a few years back, and so that's just kind of a sign. I mean, it's almost like they're holding back the good news. But that tells us, that's why, China they probably can and should go bolder. But we're hearing this call coming from China's own energy experts that they can do more. And I think that, with the construction of the coal-fired power plants, the central government green-lighted them. And, as Dr. Ye said, this was not, this locks in. Maybe they won't end up opening them, in which case, maybe they won't lock in the carbon, but in which case they've wasted money, right? And I think that if there was maybe more political space in the area of coal-fired power plants, because that's probably one area, Dr. Teets, wouldn't you agree that we don't necessarily see protests outside coal-fired power plants? That if you had, more citizen participation, that would actually lead to better climate policy in China, particularly in this space. And that's something that we've kind of lost some of over the past few years.
Mr. Chairman, I have time, I cannot really see I have time or not. I have one more question. Is that okay to proceed?
Congresswoman Steele, why don't you go right ahead? We will expand the time available and do stay around, because I think we might have time for a second round.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm gonna do you think that EU and United States has truly tried to hold the CCP accountable, or turn a blind eye for economic gain? I can just get from any.
I can talk. I don't want to be. I said, kind of the Irish in me want to talk a lot, but anyone else want to jump? So you're saying that, I mean, I think that what kind of turning back the clock a little bit, that when during the Obama administration and even under G.W. Bush, that he also started building up kind of U.S.-China conversations on, cooperating on energy and climate, but it really accelerated in the Obama administration. That kind of, I'll call it climate diplomacy, that did have an effect of probably putting on some pressure. Maybe it is this kind of, cooperative competitors kind of angle. And we saw that even in the space of like the IPR challenges, which has been a rightful huge complaint against China for stealing clean energy technologies from foreign companies. But in the clean energy research centers for like building energy efficiency, renewable energy, electric vehicles, that in addition to developing the technologies, there was some work on trying to hammer out joint IPR. And we have seen that the Chinese government itself, I mean, starting back in around 2006 to 2015, that they realized that their own domestic innovation was coming under threat because other Chinese companies were stealing each other's IPR. And so, we have seen that, again, enforcement can be probably selectively lax, but there is a movement so that this kind of, some of the trend lines are looking promising. And I guess the way I'm kind of like, hopefully you feel like I'm not evading your question, just trying to answer that when there was more interaction on energy and environmental issues, that I don't want to say that it wasn't just done to hold them accountable, but in effect it does, that both countries are moving forward. I mean, it led to the US also accelerating our own solar and other kind of clean energy projects.
I guess I would add that I don't think the US and EU have, the US, yes, I think the US has been interested in its own economic position and issues. It's also very difficult for the US to hold China accountable on something like coal-fired power plants because it's a global problem, and China knows that, right? And China is going to look at what other countries do as other countries try to hold it accountable. So I think we absolutely need to focus on, embedded emissions and things like, pushing China to have a coal consumption cap with regulatory consequences, commit to stop building coal-fired power plants, but the US can't do that effectively without reining in its own emissions within the way that China is framing things.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I just want to check in, and we see that Congressman Mast is potentially with us, but we don't have his video, so I'll just pause and see if he wants to jump in here or not. Congressman Mast, we're giving you a few more seconds, and then we'll go ahead. Okay, we do not see him with us right now, so I'm going to go back to take the Senate side here, and I want to go back to Ms. Nelema. You say in your testimony that the United States should enforce the Tariff Act, and I think you're referring to the 1930 Tariff Act, which specifically said that the U.S., it's illegal for the U.S. to import products that were made with forced labor. Do I have the correct reference that you are making?
Yes.
And so the Forced Labor Uyghur Act that Congressman McGovern and I have been both involved in basically clarifies that indeed, if products are made in Xinjiang, it's presumed that they are made with forced labor, so that the Tariff Act would apply. Is there currently sufficient capacity or resources to produce polysilicon, solar-grade polysilicon outside of China, or would that manufacturing base have to be rebuilt very quickly?
There are three capacity building opportunities that require urgent investment. The first one is expansion of the U.S. manufacturing capacity for the whole solar supply chain from the quartz to the module. The second one is expansion of alternative technologies like thin film. This is already happening and should be given support by the Biden administration. The third, investment in the development of the new technologies that were previously too expensive to pursue because Chinese polysilicon was so cheap. The US should encourage the development banks like the IFC, even USA, to support projects internationally that will build the capacity, and to strictly apply the monitoring process to ensure the expansion does not simply lead to more human rights abuses. And this comes through expansion of already existing metallurgical grade silicon to a wafer facility around the world, such as in Malaysia. The second, building a new capacity in India, which I think the Indian government is key on. But the reality, yes, all of this costs money and time, but this is the right time for it. And when urgency is so clear and commitment to advancing infrastructure and the renewable energy is so global. So I think it is not just the US government should be investing. This can be a multiple organization, multiple government that seek to expand the capacity.
Yes, I would summarize that by saying it's very appropriate for President Biden and other international leaders to come together and create a massive initiative to develop supply chains for either, as you put it, the alternative technologies, new technologies, but also supply chain for polysilicon, solar grade polysilicon, so that this dilemma is eliminated. Earlier this year, the Solar Energy Industries Association issued a solar supply chain traceability protocol, and they urged multinational solar companies to shift the supply chains out of Xinjiang. However, several experts on China's forced labor programs contend that the Chinese restrictions on auditors and the movement of Uyghur workers to firms all over China make traceability of forced labor extremely difficult, if not impossible. Do the solar industry's current traceability protocols allow firms to audit their supply chains for forced labor sufficiently?
I see something I want to see something I observed during my research and over the last few months since our report was published. We watched that the corporate decision maker contoured themselves trying to figure out how to respond to this solar forced labor in the solar supply chains. We have also watched the consultant descend on them, offering on the ground audits of the Xinjiang factories, which is strictly impossible. And we also heard the slick technologies, which cannot be identified Uyghur forced labor, and completely unreliable questionnaire, which they expected the Chinese company will self-report their abuse. This won't work. And the companies have no leverage to remediate the situation on the ground in the Uyghur region. Because the Chinese government, they have a strict companies from the, they restricted companies for complying with the US government sanctions. So if they even interviewing the workers about their rights to completely unreliable, because once they tell the truth, these Uyghur workers, they tell the truth, and then the consequences is they will send directly to the internment camps. So how are we going to get the real answer from the Uyghur region?
Yeah, so extremely difficult to get credible information, but we know certainly from many different sources about the actual way that the citizens are being treated inside Xinjiang and the Uyghur community. But I think it just reinforces why we need international efforts to really distance ourselves from any products made in Xinjiang, and particularly to develop alternatives to polysilicon produced there. I would turn to Dr. Turner, and can my team just tell me how much time I have left? 7 minutes goes so quickly. Dr. Turner, you talked about air apocalypses and in your testimony. And can you explain to us what those were and how those have affected citizen advocacy in China and the government's response?
Oh, I mean, it was an amazing and a kind of, I mean, it was exciting to see the response. And in fact, it was so back in 2012, 2013, 2014, we started seeing just in Beijing, just off the Richter scale of PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5, very small air pollution that was just, you couldn't see the building across the street. As a side note, I have friends in Liaoning who said it's been like that for years here, but when it hits Beijing, you know, it's critical. And the U.S. Embassy at the time, I don't know if you know the story, that how they put an air quality monitor on the roof of the embassy and started tweeting out, or WeChatting out at that point, what the air quality was. And then next to what the Chinese government had, there was also citizens started flying kites with citizen science, taking their own monitors. Or I think, Dr. Tietz, you probably know the one where some NGOs were renting out air quality monitors. So citizens started becoming really empowered to say, like, we don't believe that the air is moderate. And we're seeing that our government's scale on what was a moderately polluted day was, I mean, it was toxic. I mean, you can't see across the street. And so, I mean, it really was the citizen response. And then you know, and then Tsai Ching's movie too, which, as you noted, was brought out, you know, Chinese news media organizations, they helped launch it. But it wasn't theirs to launch. And so it kind of tells you that at the time, a lot of disgruntled people. And so I think that's why we did see really quick reforms that, I mean, besides just, you know, campaign, it wasn't just a campaign. There was an air pollution action plan. They changed the basic environmental law that was going to require that if local governments did not meet air quality standards, you would lose your investment, your economic development investments. Local governments you know, you wouldn't get your promotion. So the air pollution issue started, it changed the laws, and that there were more hammers on local governments. And then it started moving over to a water pollution action plan. I don't know if you know this, that every little river in China, that there's some local official who has made a river chief. And what makes me laugh, totally, I mean, you'd love this as a legislator. Evidently, if you're a river chief, you have lifetime responsibility and culpability. So even after you retire, they can come back for you. I don't see how they could do it, but definitely a case of trying to light a fire to get local governments to enforce the rules, which of course we know for many years, you know, starting back with Deng Xiaoping, I don't care what color the mouse is, or, you know, cat is, just catch the mice, right? Local governments were told just develop, and environment wasn't a priority. So in some ways, China in their own ways kind of maybe starting to create little federal kind of checks and balances, which didn't exist before. And I
Thank you
definitely
very much,
right through your 7
Dr.
minutes.
Turner.
Sorry.
I am going to check in to see if Congressman Smith is with us. Not hearing a response, we're going to turn to Senator Ossoff. Senator Ossoff, you're up next. You have 7 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Merkley, and thank you for convening this meeting. Question for you, please, Ms. Ilima, about forced labor in Western China and solar supply chains, a matter I know you've investigated.
Senator Ossoff, I think we've lost your voice there for a moment.
Mr. Chairman, do you have my signal?
We have your voice back now, but we lost you there for a while. And we appear to be losing you again. We can see your lips moving, but hear no sound. Okay, I'm checking back in for technical difficulties here. Can people hear me okay? Nod your heads if you can. Okay, I see a thumbs up. Okay, yes. Senator Ossoff, do you want to try speaking again, and we'll see if we receive your voice? We are not hearing you right now, but as soon as your staff tells my staff you're back online, we're going to go to you directly. So I'll fill in with a question while we're waiting for resolution of that technical problem. And I want to turn again, Dr. Turner, to you. And China has pledged that they will reach peak CO2 emissions before 2030. But that's not a commitment to any absolute reduction. Certainly, it's basically a statement they're going to increase production of CO2 up through 2030, and yet we are in this kind of zone red or a red alert stage, as the international scientists have described it in terms of climate. Is there international discussion with China that China needs to step up and do more than talk about expanding their carbon production for another 9 years, that they need to reach peak and start decreasing in absolute terms very quickly? Is there any receptivity at all among the Chinese leadership, President Xi and so forth, to international discussion of China as the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world? The United States is second in that China has to show their international leadership by moving much faster, and that they should use Glasgow as an opportunity to provide a much more bold strategy.
Yes, I mean, there's definitely, as I mentioned earlier, that we know that, again, even within the Chinese government, Chinese energy researchers, I mean, Tsinghua University's report that said, we're gonna, our overseas, and on the overseas side, there does seem to be some receptivity, because there's been a lot of pressure, and even a lot of the countries where China was putting in coal are starting to say that they don't want it, even though we do know that the need for electricity, I mean, think of, Pakistan, something like 30% of the people don't have steady electricity. But, for years, people have been, talking about, and maybe this is the moment where, China has good, if done with good, clean supply chains. I mean, they've done a lot with solar, with wind, but also energy efficiency. Again, a lot of that was really expanded under partnerships with the US, building energy efficiency. I mean, something like 50% of China's CO2 emissions are embedded in both the construction and the running of buildings, and creating better standards, greening the supply chains. We've seen, actually, there's a Chinese business NGO that has been working on, they've developed a certification method for buildings that more and more, cities and building operators are adopting, so that there's, I think that, I know that it's not just the coal question, but really if China can start moving on some of these other really good success stories within China that aren't coal related, and I mean, again, demand side management, energy efficiency, that those are some of the things that could also be incredibly helpful. And even the grid, we do know that they are starting to build more grid power lines. I mean, in Southeast Asia, some of that is linked to the hydropower, which I know that maybe Dr. Ye can go in maybe a little more about what that could mean for, because if not coal, I think, I don't know if I can punch it over to Dr. Ye, but if not coal, then probably hydropower in some places. And what does that mean? I mean, that's the tricky part. Maybe I'll if I don't want to put you on the spot, Dr. Ye, but maybe you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that China's building a lot of hydropower, which is very problematic downstream and within the country. But it's important to emphasize that China doesn't need more power right now, right? That it really has more than enough. And so what is happening, I think, is again that they want to spend the money somewhere. They want to spend the capital in these big, large infrastructures, including hydropower, and that I think part of the global conversation, including with China and the US, needs to be that large hydropower isn't carbon neutral, right? That it produces a lot of carbon emissions during the building, that the reservoirs have a lot of methane emissions, which is worse than carbon dioxide. And so certainly the big hydropower is in many ways damaging as much as the coal-fired power plants are.
Very good. Well, the press of a button can cure it here. And we're still waiting for Senator Ossoff to be able to rejoin us. And we think that we have another congressman possibly online. Congressman Swazi may be with us. If so, turn on your video and we'll go to you next, Congressman. Meanwhile, I wanted to focus on this point because in your testimony, you talk about the greenhouse gas emissions from large dams. And normally we think about hydroelectricity as a much cleaner, greener version. It has a lot of impacts on the stream. Coming from Oregon, we are really focused on the huge impact on salmon and so forth. Also, the still water can warm up, can be warmed up by the sun more, it changes the temperature of the stream. So there's a lot of effects. But still, when it comes to production of energy, we normally think of it as carbon-free, and yet you talk about large dams as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And you started to just now address why large dams actually produce greenhouse gases, but can you go back through and highlight that point? Because I think that's very unexpected observation.
Yeah, it has to do with the reservoirs. So I'm talking about large dams that have large reservoirs that flood a lot of biomass, and the decomposition of flooded biomass and organic materials generates methane. So that's what I was referring to in that case.
So
People
methane,
have also talked about just
methane,
the, yeah.
methane bubbling up out of the water behind the dam.
These reservoirs are often very large.
And does that continue over time, or are we talking about an initial kind of decomposition of flooded biomass that after a year or two that effect disappears, or are we talking about also biomass that's swept down the stream, gets trapped behind the dam, and then decomposes?
It swept down the stream into mostly in the reservoirs. As the reservoir is filling and expanding, it takes much longer than a year or two for that decomposition to happen.
And this produces far more methane than if the biomass that swept into the stream normally had just continued down the stream without a dam. Okay.
Yes, it doesn't decompose.
Well, that's a very interesting point that I had not heard before. Congressman Swazi, are you with us? See your name. We did not hear you in person, and I'll check again on Senator Ossoff, who is having technical difficulties. No. Okay. I wanted to turn to this question. You talk about caterpillar fungus, and most people have no idea what it is that you're referring to in terms of how this product became what it is and how it became a significant source of money to people in Tibet, and how it might be being affected by climate. So can you address caterpillar fungus?
Yes, it's a particular kind of spore that parasitizes a kind of moth, a ghost moth, and then it goes to the surface and it takes over and grows out of its head. It's been used for, it's been in Chinese medicine for many hundreds of years, but it really took off in the 1990s as there was this reports that the Olympics team had taken, caterpillar fungus and it produced kind of miraculous results for them. There was also, it was used in SARS. And so it's become worth more than its weight in gold. So it's really become a very, very, very important source of income. And it also is for people who don't have other forms of livelihood, resettled herders. They can go back and they can actually dig it. So because the products for rural Tibetans on the market are worth very little, grain and their animal products can't compete in the market. So they really rely on this. Many people rely on this for up to 80% of their income. And there are reports of declines in harvest. There's, some evidence that because there's so many people going to harvest them, there is some over harvesting going on, but a lot of it also has to do with habitat shift as a result of climate change and melting permafrost and the sort of frost heave from permafrost melt, which makes it, it makes it not found in areas that it used to be found. The importance for Tibetans is just, it's really helped them navigate resettlement and kind of the demands for cash in the changing economy.
Well, one of the things that you described is how Chinese government policies have relocated nomads and pastoralists into villages of houses, often far from where they used to live, and with kind of significant social and cultural effects. And is this a policy that is publicly justified by talking about the tragedy, the commons, and overuse of rangeland, the sharing of rangeland, or is essentially are we seeing the effect on the rangelands of climate change?
There are effects on the rangelands of climate change in some places, particularly where it's getting drier rather than wetter. But this has been publicly stated as an adaptation to both climate change and to overgrazing. It's also stated as a development policy, which I would argue it is not, but this idea that living in a city and living in a settlement is more developed and modern than being a pastoralist is very strong, and it is certainly marketed to the public in that way. My argument is that it's really not adaptive to the climate. So even where the government has recognized that climate change does have some effects on the rangeland, but saying that this is a form of adaptation, I think that's very problematic because, again, removing grazing completely actually doesn't help the rangeland because it's evolved with grazers over millennia.
So is this process really kind of wiping out a significant kind of sector of Tibetan culture and tradition?
Yes, I would say yes. And in some cases, herders, they're supposed to move for 10 years and then they're technically allowed to go back. But after selling off your livestock, after not having income, after, that really dramatic change is really hard for people to go back. And Tibetan is traditionally a rural society. They have a lot of kind of ties to territorial deities, land practices, and those are broken by these processes.
And you note something I think is very important, which is you have a complex set of skills in being a herder, that those skills do not translate when you're moved into some housing complex far from your roots in terms of being able to make a living.
Yeah, that's correct.
Let me check in again on our House of Representatives team and see if there's anyone else lined up.
Yes, Senator Congressman Swazi here.
Congressman Swazi, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. So I have really apologized to the witnesses and to you, Senator, and to everyone and the staff. I was at a Ways and Means thing. There's a few things going on down here in Washington, as you know. So I apologize for my tardiness, and please forgive me, witnesses. I've read some of your testimony. I wasn't able to be present for a lot of it, but Senator, I always like to talk about the fact that, when Nixon went to China back in the 70s, we thought that the more that China was exposed to our way of life, the more they'd become like us. They'd adopt our theory about capitalism. They would adopt our ideas about democracy. And clearly that hasn't happened. And, China is just really bad actors. We see the Chinese Communist Party putting people in forced labor camps. We see it with the Uyghurs. We see what they've done to the Tibetans for a long, long time. We see what they do in Hong Kong with arresting young people and jailing dissidents and stopping anybody from speaking out. We really have to, and we see what they do with us economically as far as stealing technology and just cheating more or less. And so now the environment, which is something near and dear to me, certainly, and to, I'm sure everybody here on this call, is they're contributing to the destruction of the world right now. I mean, I guess we all are in some ways, but they're not waking up to that reality. And we have to figure out how we can hold them more accountable to get on board with a worldwide effort to address climate change. I was looking at the statistics. I don't know if you've all spoken about it here today, but in 1990, global greenhouse gases from China were 9% of the world's emissions. And today it's 24%. So it's gone from 9% in 1990 to 24% of greenhouse gases today. And America has gone from 17% of greenhouse gases in 1990, but now we're down to 12%. Now, a lot of that is because just the amount of greenhouse gases has gone up so much, and we've got a lower percentage. But we are aggressively moving in our country to try and address this, or at least we're trying to. But climate change is a global security issue. If there's one place that the Democrats and Republicans have found common ground on when it comes to the environment, is related to the national security threat of climate change. One of the more gratifying things I saw happen early on in my career in Congress was I was on the Armed Services Committee. I forget if it was 2017 or 18, but they included climate change as being a national security threat in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And the Republicans voted for it just nearly unanimously. I think there's one vote no. And then they tried to take it out on the floor, but 45 Republicans voted with all the Democrats to put it back into the bill, which is that we had to look at climate change and its effects on sea rises, population shifts, and everything else it's doing to threaten the world's security. So I want to ask the witnesses, what can we do to really wake up the world to the fact that China's bad actions are not limited to forced labor camps, which not even the world realizes that yet. They're not limited to the treatment of ethnic minorities like the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. It's not limited to the arrest of students and to dissidents and to journalists, but they are destroying the world's environment. I mean, how can it be that in the midst of climate change and all the concerns that we have, that 58% of energy consumption in China is still coal? So what can we do to tell the world about this and get this out there more effectively? I'm going to ask Emily to go first.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I actually think it's important to remember that China has a national plan on climate change, and that its per capita emissions and its cumulative emissions are much lower. So while I believe that China's, again, coal-fired power plants and its continued building of them is a huge problem in the context of overcapacity, I don't think China is a bad actor is the message that will actually resonate with actually either action in China or that accounts for what the US has done.
So their challenge, they're saying that their goals, which you just noted, but are not to take effect until 2060. And they're going to continue to increase their global greenhouse gas emissions from now until 2030. They're hoping they'll peak by 2030. Is that satisfactory to you?
I mean, so no, I think there should be much more aggressive action, but I also think that the aggressive action has to be matched by the same commitment from the US. Otherwise, I don't think, China will. I think the framing of that cumulative development matters a great deal to how people in China and how policymakers in China will think about what it is they need to do. I do think, I mean, Xi Jinping's, there are many problems with the way in which environmental protection has been implemented, but you do see dramatic changes on the ground in terms of nature protection and the shutdowns of mines, the shutdowns of the increase in renewable energies and so forth. So I just I don't think it's true that.
But you'll agree that it needs to be more aggressive, wouldn't you?
I would agree. And I think that's true around the world. Absolutely. I think we're in an absolute climate crisis right now.
So Jennifer, do you agree with Emily that they're not bad actors, that they're really trying the best they can? And
the scale of China, just the speed of their development, the fact that they are the world's factory, I think numbers say that, I think they're probably still true, that something like 25% of their electricity goes to producing things for export. So that it's just, it's a little bit of a shell game. That our investment in China to produce products that then we buy back here, the CO2 stays with China. It's kind of like Las Vegas, right? It stays there. It's, I think that, that China, they are going to meet, and they probably already have met their 2030 goal. But I think some of it too is that they need to, and not just China, other countries also need to kind of focus more on absolute emissions. And it's tough. Keep in mind that between 2013 and 2020, I think China, something like 2.5 million coal workers lost their jobs. And so, and we've had the same problem here. But again, the problems in China, it's on steroids just by the sheer numbers of the large population. But they are, again, all this investment in renewable energy, energy efficient buildings, they are really rapidly ramping up clean energy jobs. But you could say that, while it's at a smaller scale, we're experiencing some of the same challenges here. Because the people who lose their jobs in West Virginia and other coal areas, we don't exactly necessarily plug them right into the renewable energy projects. And so there's lots of local pressures. China is not, yes, it is top down, but there still are pressures from below. We talked about it before you came in too, that some of the issues that local governments and grid operators, they like coal, it's easy to work with, and that China's, unfortunately, a lot of the plants that are in the pipeline in China to be built that were recently green lighted, a lot of them, they're not needed. Dr. Ye mentioned that briefly, and there's a good chance they won't even get turned on. So, and that's the tragedy, that they're wasting money. They could have used that money elsewhere.
So I don't want to hog all my time here, Senator. I know that Senator Ossoff just came on as well. So let me just say that, I'm going to try and get some more information about what transpired today so I can listen, but I'm intending to continue to be much more aggressive in my trying to portray China as a bad actor, because I'm really influenced by the forced labor camps of the Uyghurs, and the fact that those exports that we're talking about, a lot of them come from the Xinjiang region, where they're putting people in forced labor camps and doing forced sterilization and what people have described as crimes against humanity. So when I see a bad actor like that, and I see a bad actor when it comes to stealing technology, and I see the arrest of people in Hong Kong, when I see the treatment of the Tibetans, I can't credit them that they're doing the best they can regarding climate change either. So I'm going to remain being a little bit more aggressive about this. I'm willing to be educated more. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Senator.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator Ossoff.
May I say one thing? Just that I totally agree about Xinjiang, but I do think it needs to be disaggregated. The Chinese government isn't one person, and there's lots of different interests at stake. So I think we will make more efforts by having some form of cooperation on places where there can be cooperation, and that will actually be the only leverage that the U.S. has on these other issues that we care about, like Xinjiang.
Well, I'm fully supportive of the president's effort, our president's efforts, and President Xi to try and disaggregate and be cooperative on the issue of climate. I'm totally for that, but I want to see results. And until I see results, I'm going to continue to put pressure on aggressively about the bad actions of the Chinese Communist Party and the way that they treat people just inhumanely. And I think that we need to continue to put that pressure on, and then they can see this climate change cooperation as being an opportunity to put on a better face to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Congressman. Senator,
is it
I want to
possible
make
for
sure
me-
Senator Ossoff has a chance to get his time in, since we had technological difficulties before, and then we'll come back to you, Doctor. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that the technological issues are resolved. Ms. Elima, would you please characterize the extent of forced labor in solar supply chains, for example, the production of polysilicon, ingots, other inputs to solar technology in China and specifically in Xinjiang?
So when it's come to the forced labor in Xinjiang, is this labor transfer program, let me be clear first, this labor transfer program, it indeed exists in other part of the China, but in Xinjiang alone, the poverty alleviation program, which is including the surplus labor and labor transfer program, is designed on a logic that indigenous people who don't actively participate or refuse to participate is affected by the separatism, extremism, terrorism. So if a person does not comply with state-sponsored labor transfer program offered to them, then they seem to be some radicalized and a potential terrorist. They can be sent to the internment camp. So when the Xinjiang government, central government, and local government to practice this labor program, they same time also give a lot of incentivize to the company like metallurgical companies, Hoshan, and polysilicon company in Xinjiang. And then when the forced labor, this product has been made by the forced labor, then they send it to, can also sell to the modular company. In fact, the Jinko Solar, the world's second largest modular company, itself also participated in this labor transfer program. So everything, and because the polysilicon and the ingot, they can be blended. So it's legit to say almost entire world panel has been affected by the forced labor. So this is not like specific one company participate in the forced labor, then we don't buy from them. But it's the root of the problem is the Hoshan, and then they sell to the DOCO and then sell to the entire world. So it's impossible to say we don't buy from the one company. It's tainted by the entire supply chain.
So just to summarize, Ms. Elima, your response, am I correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but am I correct in characterizing what you just said, that the entire solar supply chain originating from Xinjiang is potentially tainted by the use of forced labor?
Yes, because the raw material, it's not only sell to the company inside Xinjiang and sell to the other part of the city in China. They also directly sell to the world. For example, the Hoshan silicon, they sell the silicon-based production to the United States. So a lot of stuff has been tainted here, not only the polysilicon, metallurgical silicon, the solar grade silicon is also including electronic silicon. So not only the solar, actually, most of
Thank you, Ms. Elima. And the Biden administration has taken two actions, both of which are positive. First, moving to stop imports of silica-based products from companies believed to use forced labor, and also announcing a goal to utilize solar energy for 45% of the nation's electricity by 2050, which is vital to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and averting catastrophic climate change outcomes. Do you believe we can meet those goals? 45% of our nation's energy production mix from solar without relying upon forced labor derived products from Western China, unless we build our own domestic solar industry so that we are independent of these Chinese supply chains? Isn't it necessary that the United States have its own solar manufacturing supply chain in order to build this solar energy generation capacity without relying upon supply chains that may be tainted by forced labor?
It doesn't have to be only built in the United States. I mean, we still can expansion the already existing metallurgical grade silicon to wafer facility that, for example, in Malaysia, and we can also still build a new capacity in India. It doesn't have to be only in the United States, and I don't think this is the only thing should be the United States to invest in. Like I mentioned before, United States should work as with its allies, and yeah, to expand these capacities at the global chains required.
So, Ms. Elima,
Ross,
in order to meet our,
I'm going to
yeah, Mr.
intervene
Chairman, go
here.
ahead.
Yes.
Sure.
I'd be a little more flexible, but your 7 minutes are up, and Co-Chair McGovern has returned from his Rules Committee and hasn't had a chance to participate yet. So
No problem. Thank you,
go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman.
Or so 7 minutes and turn to Chair McGovern.
Well, thank you. Hold on, let me see. Let me get my video on here. Thank you, and I want to thank Senator Ossoff for his questioning. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement from the International Campaign for Tibet on China's environmental challenges and the U.S. response.
So ordered.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ye, thank you for your testimony and your dedication to research on the grasslands of the Tibetan Plateau. Your work helped inform my staff as we put together the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. The legislation directs the State Department to engage with the Chinese government, the Tibetan people, and non-governmental organizations to encourage the participation of Tibetan nomads and other Tibetan stakeholders in the development and implementation of grassland management policies. So in your testimony, you say, direct international pressure is sometimes useful. At other times, it can lead to unintended consequences for some PRC citizens. How big is the window, if any, for cooperation on grasslands in the current political environment?
Thank you for your question. I think there is probably room for encouraging and working with an increasing number of Chinese scientists who are also saying that there are problems with past policies and the assumptions. I think social science work by, direct policy engagement feels very, very difficult to me right now because of all the restrictions that are, the ways in which all the environmental NGOs, grassroots associations within Tibetan areas have been shut down pretty much. But I do think there is an increasing number of Chinese scientists who are, starting to see the flaws of, ecological migration, for example, and some of those problems. So I do think scientific engagement should be encouraged. I just feel like right now, very direct statements of problems are not welcome.
So you also say that China is very likely to point to the U.S.'s own record on a variety of issues, and this should be taken into account when the framing of the policy. Would a genuine domestic policy commitment to climate help demonstrate U.S. sincerity, do you think?
I believe so. I mean, that's certainly been their, the easy talking point that the Chinese government has used for a very long time.
To Dr. Turner, China's 14th five-year plan adopted in March of 2021 and covering the years 2021 to 2025 would allow continued increases in coal production to 2025, support investment in new coal-fired electric capacity, and set a first ever target for minimum energy production capacity. What do you see as the implications of China's 14th five-year plan, if any, for China's effort to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060?
Well, there's hope that maybe some of this will change because in some ways it contradicts some of the bigger, longer term energy plans that are out there. Should note that it seems that the 14th five-year plan is a bit silent on the fact that that a lot of these, some of these, the 200 in planning plants, again, not all of them will be built, but a number of them are replacing older plants with these newer ultra supercritical plants. But then I keep going back to, they currently are overcapacity on coal. So it doesn't seem very logical. It's kind of like a local jobs plan. And if I could just do a quick, just to reflect back on the previous question about, keeping in mind that I think there's also another opportunity with China heading up the Convention on Biodiversity. And there's going to be a fall, there's going to be a fall virtual, I don't know, is it virtual? I know there's going to be a meeting in the fall and another one in the spring. They split it up. Now, the US and China, we have worked together for decades on cooperating on national park development. And the biggest park, Sanjiangyuan, I have to ask Dr. Ye, did they actually open it yet? It was supposed to open last year. Did they open it yet?
They've implemented a ranger program, but there's no legal framework, and it doesn't seem to be actually operating as a park yet.
But what's notable is that one of the I had my last meeting before the March closure, where we all ran out the door with our laptops under our arms, was I had about U.S.-China cooperation on national parks, and one of the Chinese looked at what we did in ours and said, well, you chased out your Native Americans, and they're like, and luckily our park system folks said, don't do that. And that while it's not yet formalized, there are quite a few Tibetans who are allowed, they're raising their yaks in this gigantic national park. And I remember one of my favorite questions was to the Park Service guy, who was saying that, well, the Chinese said, well, we should get rid of these yaks. And they're like, no, wildlife is good in parks. And they saw it as a real way to attract tourism, but also just to maintain how the grasslands have been maintained for millennia that Dr. Ye had mentioned before. And so there's, so continued engagement on the national parks can, maybe promote, correcting the mistakes that, not making the same mistakes that we did with that. But again, there's also the climate issue too, that, China is, one of Xi Jinping's big goals too, is like gonna plant more trees. This is great, but maybe opportunities to call out the fact that China's soybeans, leather, and beef imports from Latin America are leading to growing deforestation there. So it's kind of like this little dichotomy of what happens at home and what happens abroad, a little different. But we are seeing the European and US legislators kind of coming together and talking about, well, what can the US and Europe do to raise the bar and standards onto preventing this kind of deforestation that, of course, has big ramifications for climate change. So that the EU and the US could be the ones that set the global standards.
Well, thank you. And I know my time is up.
Together in that way. But yeah.
No, but I appreciate that. I appreciate all the panelists. I've read all your testimony. I've heard some of it while I was in the Rules Committee. But let me just say this. The environment, protecting our planet is a human rights issue. And the United States and China both have a self-interest, right, in getting this right, ultimately. At the same time, we have to, it can't be an either or with, let's talk about the climate and let's not talk about some of the other things that are happening that are quite disturbing right now. So we're going to have to thread that needle. But again, the motivation for China, just like the motivation for the United States in dealing with the climate crisis, there is a self-interest. Both countries, owe it to their people and to the world. But your contributions here were very, very valuable. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, and thank you for accommodating me.
Thank you, Co-Chair McGovern, and I know you were doing important work in trying to set up a strategy so the government is not shut down at the end of September. So much appreciated. We are running out of time, but there are two topics that haven't been addressed that I think would be valuable to address. And Dr. Turner, you note in your testimony that China has started using various market mechanisms, including an emissions trading, I think a scheme is the word I believe used, or maybe it was system, ETS, that I think was implemented just earlier this year. What sector of the economy is covered by that, and is it up and operating? Is it too soon to evaluate whether it could have any particular value in motivating reductions in global warming gases?
Thank you for that question. Well, similar to, in Europe, it takes a long time to get an emission trade system on board. And China started, planning about it in 2015. So a little bit of a Groundhog Day situation where we launched it, we didn't. But now there is a national one launched, and it does focus just on the power sector, which of course we all know is the main source of CO2 emissions. Still a work in progress, but should note that, in EU, once they formally launched it, it really took them 10 years to get it right. So, I mean, I think it's one of these maybe like institutions in waiting. I mean, it's being implemented. There's a lot of work before COVID, there was a lot of US, China, exchanges. The Energy Foundation was also very instrumental early on to getting, helping the Chinese researchers figure out what it was. So there's some slippage that maybe the caps for the coal-fired power plants aren't as hard as they need to be, but some of this is just also to educate them on how it works. But I think it's something too that maybe Dr. Tietz might know too, that this is an area, I mean, there was some more technical NGOs that have been involved on it, but I don't know, but it's maybe not as much of a space where there's a lot of Chinese NGO action. The bigger, possibly more important kind of technology changes really are with grid reforms and pricing. Again, one of those non-sexy kind of issues to talk about, but those kind of changes I think offer even more promise in reducing carbon emissions than in the near term for ETS. But ETS, it's still good. We have smaller regional ones in the US. We don't have a national one. Then there's that whole price on carbon question. I'm not touching. Oh, I said it. I shouldn't have said it. That's you like, don't say that question. China's not responding well to the carbon border tax that the Europeans have floated up. I guess maybe the US is not as happy with that either. But yeah, so there is some movement.
Well, the United States had a strategy that worked extremely well on sulfur dioxide, and it's always been, we had such an impact in such a short period of time. It was off the charts more successful than we anticipated, reducing sulfur dioxide dramatically at very low cost. So we keep thinking it must be possible with carbon. But as you know, we don't have a national system, and I do think monitoring China's system will be interesting, comparing it to our regional systems and the European system to see what's working and not working and why, because it certainly has kind of this power as in various pricing strategies to try to incentivize reductions that are much harder to sometimes just dictate. There's another area that we haven't talked much about, and we are, okay, a vote's underway over here in the Senate. So a very short answer, and I apologize, I'm going to have to close the gathering, but I just want to take note of this discussion of greening the Belt and Road Initiative. The criticisms of the United States and others have leveled at China for financing some 200 plus coal plants around the world at the very time that it's so essential that we be reducing our international dependence upon fossil fuels. There really isn't time to have you address this in any significant way, but I want to note that that's an area where I think it's really important for various nations, in the United States, China, with others, to say, what are our strategies in international finance? What is the World Bank doing? What is the IMF doing? What is the United States financing strategy? Because we are still not ending our financing of fossil fuel projects around the world. I've been holding conversations that consist of to the Biden administration saying, just say no. Just say, no, we will not do this anymore. And they're insisting on exceptions and strategies that kind of decline over time. But we're in such a code red moment now that I think more abrupt or dramatic or bold action is necessary. I can only give you about 30 seconds to respond if you'd like, Dr. Turner.
I also want to toss this over to Dr. Tietz. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. With the U.S., we walk the walk, talk to talk, that helps. But also, Dr. Tietz, do you want to say anything about like the Chinese NGOs that also have been kind of lighting the fire on green BRI?
Yes, and I know we're almost out of time, but thank you. The area where we do see that engagement is really helpful is especially around technical standards setting. And this is where the NGO and the research communities in China are really learning from Western counterparts. And I believe that this is where engagement can really function well. The earlier question about, should we engage with China or not? I think we absolutely should. They haven't adopted our governing principles, but they've adopted a lot of our governing tactics, like public comment periods on laws and, judges and judicial behavior. So I think engagement is really valuable, but focusing more on sort of technical skills and specific tactics, I think will be most useful.
We can't hear you, sorry.
I do that several times a day. Thank you very much, Dr. Tietz and Dr. Turner and Dr. Ye and Ms. Elima. We so appreciate your expertise being brought to bear in this discussion. I think that this area of wrestling with the challenges with our different strategies and policies and economies between the United States and China, but both having an enormous stake in the future of this planet and having very, very kind of oversized roles in how humankind, how human civilization tackles this moment. So I hope that dialogue with China, despite our criticisms of China in other areas, I hope cooperation can be sustained and enhanced in this area. I know that China has made a point of saying, as a way to kind of pressure and stop criticism and Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghurs and the treatment of citizens in Hong Kong, that you can't divorce climate policy from everything else. But really, the moment demands that while we may argue and debate and disagree over many other things in this area, the world is looking to China and the United States to really lead the way as the largest carbon dioxide producers. It's essential that we work together to have dramatic reductions far beyond what we're currently committed to. And I hope the conversation in Glasgow produces some important advances in the plans of the major producers of climate gases around the world. So with that, I will note that the record will be open through close of business on Friday for any additional submissions from members of the House or Senate for the record, and that this gathering of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.